And now, with your host of today's edition of Reliving the Past, here's Ben Hyde.
Good morning, first period. I'm your host, Ben Hyde. And today, we're going to be reviewing the 1970s. More specifically, the social, economic, and political aspects. First off, let's go to our political guru, Nick Joy.
First president to welcome us into the 1970s was Richard Nixon, who promised to end the American involvement in Vietnam by turning the war over to the South Vietnamese, a process in which he called Vietnamization. Like his predecessors, Nixon was a veteran Cold Warrior who believed that the United States could and must win in Vietnam, which later dragged on until 1973. It ended when Henry Kissinger completed the negotiations for a peace treaty with the North Vietnamese. This peace treaty crumbled almost immediately as soon as the American troops started to vacate the country. In 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese army and was united under communist rule. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973 as well in order to prevent any future president from involving the military in another undeclared war. Nixon did have success, however, in his other foreign policy initiatives, especially those concerning the world's two other superpowers, the USSR and China. With Nixon's foreign policy, the United States saw two new terms added to its vocabulary. First is détente, which was formulated by both Nixon and Kissinger, which called for countries to respect each other's differences and cooperate more closely. This also led to eventually the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine announced that the United States would withdraw from many of its overseas troop commitments, relying instead on alliances. Ford became president when Nixon resigned. Ford had been chosen to replace Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, who resigned in the face of impending criminal charges. When Ford selected his vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, it was the first time that neither the president nor the vice president had been elected by the public. Ford's pardon of Nixon brought the Watergate era to a close. It also cost Ford politically, as it raised suspicions that Nixon and Ford had struck a deal. Ford's political fortunes were further undermined by a weak economy. In 1976, he was then defeated by our current president, Democrat Jimmy Carter. Carter inherited the weak economy that Ford started, and Carter tried to balance the budget but failed, as every president had since Eisenhower. The high point of his administration came when President Carter personally brokered a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. He invited the two leaders to Camp David and personally brokered the agreement. Ever since, the United States has actively participated in peace negotiations in the region. Carter enjoyed these foreign policy successes, however, also suffered many setbacks. This was seen in when the USSR invaded Afghanistan, as well as what was seen in the Nicaragua incident. However, the worst crisis involved Iran, when hostages were taken in retaliation for America's decade-long support of the Shah. Held for more than a year, the hostages were not released until after Ronald Reagan took office. Christmas around the corner. Remember, parents, to get the new invention of the 70s, the rollerblade.
Look how lucky this boy is. I mean, he has a brand new pair of roller skates.
But let's remember to always use on hard surfaces and never to use near bodies of water.
For our economic expert, David Smith.
Throughout the 1970s, one of the major economic problems was inflation. Nixon focused on it and opposed a price freeze when it hit 5.4%, but that didn't even work. By 1979, it peaked at 13%. Another major economic problem in the 70s was unemployment. It ranged from 6 to 10%, and sometimes spouses even had to work. But the problem was, even when people did have jobs, they were lazy. Trade with China was one positive economic thing in the 70s, and in 1972, the United States and Nixon recognized Communist China, and exports reached $4 billion in 1980 because they had recognized China and reopened more trade. The end of Vietnam was also a positive, but for some Americans it was considered a loss. We lost over 58,000 troops and over 300,000 were injured. And it cost a lot of money to supply the troops and the South Vietnamese in Vietnam. One of the worst things that happened in the 1970s was the Arab oil crisis. During the Yom Kippur War, Arab nations cut off oil because the U.S. had helped Israel, and Israel was fighting the Arab nations. The price of gas quadrupled, and it went from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. After the war, when the Arabs cut off the embargo, they started up OPEC. And OPEC was where they limited production so they could raise the prices, and the Arabs realized they could maximize profits by doing this. And in 1979, 1 barrel of gas cost $34, and gas was well over $1 a gallon. And because of this, cars had become smaller, and the American plants could not keep up with the Japanese, because the Japanese were better at producing the smaller cars. The Americans just couldn't profit by doing this. Another problem in the 1970s was the Iran hostage crisis. Then it had just started in 1979, and because of this, Carter froze all assets to Iran until the hostages were released. And throughout all the 70s, federal debt was a huge problem. It went from $8.7 billion in 1970 to $72.7 billion in 1980. Social Security costed more, and social welfare payments in the decade doubled. Deficit spending became common, and nobody thought anything of it. And these are all some of the reasons why the U.S. economy was in major trouble during the 1970s.
Grab a bucket and mop, scrub the bottom and top. There is nothing so clean as my burger machine. With a broom and a brush, clean it up for the rush. Before you open the door, or to shine on the floor. When we finish one dance, start all over again. Tell me, what does it mean? At McDonald's it's clean. You deserve a break today. So get up and get away to McDonald's, McDonald's, McDonald's.
And now, an exclusive interview with former President Nixon on social aspects of the 1970s. Mr. Nixon, what were the social effects on the U.S. from the war in Vietnam?
Well, there are many effects. There were a total of 50,000 deaths of United States troops, and the Vietnam Memorial was a great way to honor the patronage, but I feel that a lot of the U.S. civilians lost faith in their government because we spent so much money on this pointless war.
Alright, very interesting. Now, what are your concerns about the hostage crisis in Iran?
Well, it's obviously the government's fault. This all could have been avoided if the government had just let the Arabs take over the Jews in the first place, and then they wouldn't have been so mad at us. Then the Arab countries wouldn't have raised their oil prices.
Alright, next question. What was your opinion on the Roe versus Wade decision?
Well, I have mixed feelings about that. I feel like some people will just have sex a lot of times and use abortion to get out of it. But in other times, I feel they are necessary, such as in interracial pregnancies.
Alright, last question. What was your opinion on the constitutionality of capital punishment, which was resumed in '76?
Well, I supported it then, I support it now, and I understand why people are making such a big deal out of it.
Okay, Nixon, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this special presentation on the 1970s. The nation's been through a lot of ups, a lot of downs, but in the end, we made it through. Stay classy, first period.